Not amalgamated copper and iron that figures out how to become Bethlehem steel, and then figures out how to do, rebar. What happens usually is organizations grow up, and this is as old organizational stuff, Arthur Stinchcomb and these guys from 60, 70 years ago. Organizations that succeed in any given era succeed because they have a workable, sensible combination of talent. They use the technology well. They build a culture. They're focused on doing something that clients and society find beneficial. And the more successful they are, the more wedded they get to their way of doing business. And you build a culture around that. And you have salary schedules. And you have 52-year-old vice presidents of manufacturing who get these, snot-nosed 26-year-olds who think they know things. And they tell them to wait their place and relax. And when these executives at places like IBM have these upstart Harvard dropouts come by with some new, software in 1979, and they say, well, that's not really what we do. We don't want to buy it. We'll lease it from you. And so these upstarts start in a garage, and they start a company, and they call it something like Microsoft, and they lease it to IBM. And they wind up with tens of billions of dollars and hundreds of rocket scientists in 1990 trying to figure out how to leverage this new thing called the internet. But they already know what they know how to do. Microsoft's advantage is that they built things like Excel and Microsoft Word. And so what Microsoft spent a whole boatload of money trying to do in the early 90s was figure out how do you crosswalk Microsoft Office to cyberspace. And it turns out what we actually wanted was to have auctions for bobbleheads. Or be able to send send pictures of our food back and forth and all these things that Microsoft. And so what happens is, so we often turn this effort of reinvention into a referendum on the smarts or the intentions or the decency of educators and school board members and superintendents. But frankly, there are few, if any, executives in any line of work who have actually figured out how to take an old established firm, fundamentally rethink the talent picture, the technology picture, the way they do, what are expectations, and then kind of seamlessly revise that. We talk a lot about building the plane while you fly it in education. There's hardly any examples in any line of work of people doing this. So I'm actually relatively skeptical that we're going to be able to do it. This is why, like in Education Unbound, I talked about the critical role of greenfield spaces, where we create room through statutory change relating to new choice options, the opportunity to launch new schools, the opportunity to use cyberspace and launch virtual schools, the kind of stuff Holly has built, for instance, in Florida Virtual, where people are able to rethink a lot of these assumptions in much more fundamental ways. So for me, it's less whether or not we'll be able to do that, but whether we're going to get the heck out of the way enough that we're going to let the people who are going to draw on a fresh sheet of paper to figure out how to get there. And I'm not at all confident that we have any appetite for that. In fact, for me, a lot of my friends in the reform community, quote unquote, have spent a lot of the last 5 years trying to micromanage, to my mind, how we use labor, how we evaluate whether teachers are good at their jobs, trying to write new strictures and regulations about how do we improve schools that we're not satisfied with. And my concern is not only does this actually take us in many cases in the wrong direction, but it actually creates new obstacles where there used to be greenfield, whether in virtual space or in terms of, say, charter schooling.
What I would add, if you want to see an example of a company that's trying to reinvent itself that's large in the middle of innovation, look at Kaplan, right? We used to be the disruptors, right, in higher education and elsewhere, coming out of Stanley Kaplan's history of basically getting people who weren't supposed to get into these fancy colleges, he got them into these fancy colleges, right? So there's a legacy of kind of this iconoclastic approach to people can succeed who aren't supposed to succeed, right? And so the higher ed space, we've been one of those folks who've been happily disrupting it along the way. But now we're this large, sloppy, old entity. I gave a talk in San Francisco. It was actually one of these TEDx things that I did, and there was a lot of entrepreneurs there. And afterwards, people came up and said, "Really love your ideas about cognitive science, how it works, but you've got to leave Kaplan because you'll never be able to get it done there. Come join us, man. We're doing cool stuff." And my view is, I don't know. We're going to try. Kaplan has a lot of legacy operations. But the CEO and the senior folks have committed to redesigning the thing And places like Kaplan Test Prep that used to be entirely brick and mortar, now half of what they do is pure online delivery of test prep services. They're still doing brick and mortar. And around the globe we're transitioning that way. And then finally, the charge for me from the beginning 4 years ago was change the language of how learning is thought about, designed, processed, updated to take into account evidence and learning science. And so we are doing that. Now, will we succeed? Well, you got to watch the space for a few more years. But we've got 30 randomized controlled trials running at Kaplan University right now. We're going to get another 100 of them running next year, all tied into learning science principles. And we're going to have a darn good run at trying to show how you do this in a different way, using our scale, and we'll see how it goes. But it's not easy at all. People can try, and I think people should try, but it's not easy.
That's right. And two or three quick takeaways here, because I certainly don't mean to sound defeatist. I just think we need to be going to this with our eyes wide open. Two or three quick takeaways. One is it's difficult to do this, as I just said, even in a private setting, but it's doubly hard in a public setting because public officials tend to be risk averse. Your reputation's on the line. And so what happened, this is useful to keep in mind when you're in a school and you're frustrated with your AP or you're frustrated with the tech folks at the district, that they seem not to get something that makes a lot of sense to you. Part of the thing to keep in mind is they've got real pressures on them. If you get an auditing exception when the feds decide to come in and look at use of Title I or Title II, that can be a real career ender for somebody. So it's not just, we often say, if it's the right thing to do for kids, well, who cares? Well, that's easy to say when you're in a classroom, which is funny because teachers say, I have it hardest. But it's easy to say when your butt's not the one on the line for signing off for those funds. It's actually really hard when your butt is on the line. So it's not enough to say it's the right thing to do. It's not enough to say here's the research. We also need to work with those folks to help them find a way to interpret the rule, the statute, the regulation in which they can claim that this is a reasonable use. And the thing is, an astonishing amount of the time you can do that. But mostly when I work with districts, I don't find people putting in that extra elbow grease. They make the case for why it's a good idea. They get told no. They say, oh, those friggin' idiots. And they go back and bitch in the teacher's lounge. And what we need to do is get into this habit where you presume until they prove otherwise that they're not anti-kid, but that they're worried about getting their butt in a sling, and then see if you can work through their problem, even as you ask them to help work through yours. So that's one. And I think if we had a lot more of that kind of behavior, I would be more optimistic about our ability to kind of nimbly and agilely change this. A second thing is it's easy for old routines to kind of just habitually bleed over. Holly and I have talked about this a bunch in the case of Florida Virtual. Back when they were launching, it just made sense to think about teacher quality in terms of the same way we always thought about teacher quality. What's a good classroom teacher? But here we are. We've had a bunch of virtual learning going on now for 15 years in various contexts, and I have seen very little by way of research and diagnostic where we're trying to figure out how are online instructional skills different from those in a brick and mortar. So if you look at states, for instance, that are requiring Charlotte Danielson or the Bob Marzano frameworks under their teacher evaluation expectations, they're applying these online exactly the way they are in brick and mortar. So if you've ever read the Charlotte Danielson framework, as much as I love Charlotte and I think it's a good framework, there's stuff that just doesn't make any sense in an online environment, but we have kind of casually allowed these assumptions to translate. So I think one of the ways we can, and again, this goes back to where we started, one of the ways we can increase the likelihood that policymakers and leaders are going to get, are not going to get in our way is by making sure that we are not talking about technology as something different, but talking about technology in something that just makes a lot of sense from parents' perspective, from problem-solving perspective, from a teacher's perspective, and what it'll take for us to use it in that way. And I don't think we talk nearly enough. And certainly when you talk to parent groups or when you talk to school board members, that's not the message they hear. The message they hear is in a public forum, somebody tells them if they spend $23 million on iPads, that test scores are going to be up 8 points next year.
Which is bizarre. And I think that comes back to that very first point we made, which is whether you're arguing for something new or you're trying to design something new, start from the learning problem and then figure out, well, what is this solution doing that addresses either that problem or else leaves the problem, and the way it is, but does something for your economics or your distribution or whatever it is. And that kind of reasoning, as Rick said earlier today, gets the learning engineer to be in the caboose instead of stuck in the back. Because now you're leading. You're actually looking at the problem, trying to press a solution forward. And you don't always win. No engineer wins all their attempts to get stuff done. But you get invited back because of the expertise you show. So Rose, you had your hand up. So.
Well, you've gotten really close to my question a couple of times. I'm a parent in my 11th year with my own children in statewide online school, empowered by a for-profit company who made that possible for us and for a school district that was interested in it. I'm interested in your thoughts. I know that you've done work on this, Dr. Hess, on the role of the for-profit and what we can do to make sure that they are part of the answer, and that we can't rely on nonprofits to do it just because we think it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, here's something, I have a pretty strong view on the role of for-profits. Michael Horn and I did a book that came out a couple months ago with Teachers College Press, if you're interested, called Private Enterprise and Public Education. And Michael and I, we said, look, very simply put, for-profits pose unique concerns. There is a concern that they are going to rip people off, and there is a concern that they are going to, if you ever watch late night infomercials, that they are going to try to sucker people into procuring a shoddy product or service, and there's a concern that they are going to squeeze quality in the name of profit. That's innate. That's innate to the logic of what for-profits do. They're supposed to try to grow, and they're supposed to try to squeeze costs.
I'm not taking this personally yet, so.
But when you listen to the conversations about gainful employment, when you listen to my friend Diane Ravitch talk about privatization even by nonprofits, I don't even know what that means. When you listen to so many attacks, there seems to me a profound misunderstanding of the flip side of that coin. That the problem with public sector entities is that what we talked about before, there's a huge incentive to cover your butt, and that can make people very reticent to try new things, to zero out ineffective programs, to tick people off. And the problem with nonprofits is they have a huge incentive to gold plate. If you're Teach for America or KIP, no matter how terrific you are, and I'm a huge fan of both, you have an incentive to maintain your reputation at all costs, because that's how you raise money, even if it limits your growth and even if it drives up your cost. So TFA used to cost, when it started, $10,000 per recruit. Today it costs more than $40,000 per recruit. I've never heard of a private company in the history of the world whose marginal cost structure goes up 400% while it's growing in its first 20 years. KIP schools have had enormous attention, have been, a national darling for, better part of 2 decades, and they are up to 40,000 kids served in 100 schools. That is a remarkably slow rate of growth as far as I'm concerned. That's not a critique of KIP or TFA, it's how nonprofits work. They tend to be slow, they tend to err on the side of caution. For-profits, because they try to squeeze costs, and because they have an incentive to grow like wildfire, to my mind, have a crucial and phenomenally important role to play if we're ever going to really transform education at scale. I don't trust public systems to do this on their own for the reasons we talked about. I think nonprofits are a good but ultimately boutique part of this. I think large-scale delivery of learning solutions or transformations of schools and teaching will inevitably either happen because of for-profits or it won't happen at all. And right now, given how defensive for-profits are, how apologetic advocates are of for-profits, how much the best we can say is, well, for-profits should be okay if other folks are okay. We do nothing to educate parents or policymakers or educators on what for-profits bring to the table. We do nothing to honestly acknowledge that they have real risks, but those risks can be addressed through policy and incentives. And we never talk about what I think is the bottom line, is that transformation in American education will be the work of for-profits or it will not be transformed.
One of the challenges with this is that, the buyers are the ones who define markets. It's not the sellers that define the markets. It is the buyers. And so if we can get more of our buyers, our decision makers, whether they are superintendents who are effectively buying by allowing certain new things in, or even just the normal procurement processes that go on for technology and books and so forth. We need those folks to ask, can you show me that this edition actually works better for students? Do you have any evidence at all? And the answer is no. And instead of saying, oh, okay, there should be a real irritation. And there should be somebody standing up and saying, I got $10 million and I just spent half of it on these lunkheads with no evidence. If somebody walks in here with decent evidence, I will give you this $5 million check for what you do. So go do your homework and come back, because I'm just tired of this, right? Our buyers are not ready to become irritated. And that creates a problem, because then the for-profit guys and gals, suppliers, they have to react to what the market is after. And this is one of the things...
And an advantage is the sleaze bags and the snake oil guys, yes. The advantage, rather than the people who are doing great work.
Because they don't have to invest in the stuff that matters, they can invest in what buyers want. And this is where I think, whether it's charter schools or systems of charter schools, places, and even places like Kaplan, where we actually have students kind of within our mix, we start to buy things based on the principles we've been talking about today. And so I literally ask people who come in with things they want us to use for our students, show me the randomized controlled trial evidence, which usually you get a deer in the headlights look from them, right? And then it's like, well, will you participate in a randomized controlled trial with us? And then there's a real sort of desperate uncertainty about, what? Really? Us? And yeah, you, right? Otherwise, we're either not going to do it, or you're going to have to do it at an incredibly slashed cost, because we're going to have to fix this bowl of spaghetti that you've created that doesn't work very well for learning, as far as I can tell. And so, your choice, right? And so we need buyers who are starting to ask and demand more things that line up with how learning works. And then parents as well, ask about these things. The classic quote about parents is, all parents think American education is a train wreck except for their school. Their own school's great, right? So it's kind of it's like the Lake Wobegon effect in education, right? It's like, what is going on with this, right?
That's right.
How do you explain the tendency of for-profits and charter schools in places like Chicago of trying to take professional teachers out of the equation and come up with these, you're a teacher for 3 years and then you go into the private sector, because charter schools, their model, they don't want lifelong teachers, and how can we have an education system without people who devote their careers to their craft?
So I think there's a couple, this is a great question. I think there's a couple things tangled. One is, keep in mind that nowadays, nationally, right, of the 3.5 million teachers, a quarter are in their first year in the classroom. So one of the things we've seen is just this phenomenal hollowing out of kind of, especially the young veterans, kind of the 5 to 15-year vets. And we've seen kind of the aging of the folks who entered in the late 80s into the 20-year plus. But we have this huge population of folks who teach for 1 year. That's just natural. And I think there's a couple broader forces at work here. One, remember, as late as the 1950s, 55% of college-educated women became teachers. This went all the way back to when we feminized teaching in the Common School era. And we did it because women were cheap labor, and we could staff out the Horace Mann Common School that way. And so we had a model built around ready availability of huge numbers of talented people who would work relatively cheap. And second, as late as the 60s, Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that a typical college grad was going to hold about 5 jobs in the course of their working career. And teaching, like many other professions, was built around kind of these assumptions of captive labor. And what's happened is I think both of those have radically altered. Nowadays, typical college grad holds 5 jobs by the age of 30, and only about 14% of college-educated women go into teaching. So we just have a fundamentally different recruitment challenge, and we have a fundamentally different kind of career expectation on the part of a lot of folks. Personally, I mean, remember, 3.5 million teachers, more than 10% of all working Americans with a college degree are classroom teachers. I personally don't think it's feasible at this point that we're going to get 3.5 million folks who are going to do this for 30 years, and I'm not sure we want them to. But that's not to argue against the crucial role of kind of professionalism and kind of. So what has always struck me as kind of a reasonable way to go is the way so many of the private schools that even Diane Ravitch is excited about have done this, where there's a core of long-time professional educators, and they are complemented by folks who come in and work for a shorter period of years, and especially in a technology era where you can complement and you're thinking teachers more like in a variety of roles where you're doing less teacher-oriented instruction and more teacher-facilitated instruction, it seems to me that those kinds of models make sense. Now, I think what's happening with charters, for instance, is one, charters are constrained by their cost models. Most of them are trying to run on 70% of districts, and for reasons that have always escaped me, they're using the same salary schedule, so they simply can't afford to put together staffs built out of veteran teachers. Second, a lot of these charters actually don't have any different theory of learning. They're using no different learning science in the district schools. So what they're trying to do is just run the same schools, but better and harder. And so they're looking for 24-year-olds who will work 95 hours a week because they don't have families and they don't have kids. And people can only do that for 3 years before they burn out. And so it's not a bad model, but it's not really a sustainable or growable model because I don't think there's nearly enough 25-year-olds to kind of do this everywhere we would want to do it. And I think partly you're right that because this has been kind of a workaround solution settled upon, say, particularly by charters, that it has become part of their culture. And so they become proud about it, and they've been attacked on it, so they get defensive about it. And so we wind up with a conversation which seems to romanticize the idea that it's better to be a two-year teacher than to be a professional educator. And I think this is actually the wrong question. I think if we focus on how do we solve problems for kids, and I think there are a number of roles where we want teachers, where you actually can conceivably build experience over 15, 20, 25 years, even if reading and math value-added scores show you plateau after 5. I don't actually believe that is true of high-quality teachers in sensitive roles. But I also believe there's lots of stuff teachers do that doesn't actually benefit all that much from additional time and expertise. A lot of this stuff might be more manageable, particularly with folks who are mid-career transfers, or stuff like what the match charter schools are doing with the intensive tutoring kind of dormitory model. So I'd like us to get much more creative about how do we put together veteran educators, complementary educators, thinking about like the medical profession, right? A surgical team is a cardiovascular surgeon, it's RNs who have less training than some training. Somewhere around there's an anesthesiologist who's between them. Working down the hallway is a candy striper handling some of the low rope stuff that you don't actually want skilled professionals doing. And I'd love to have us have this conversation without folks getting as defensive about, without being as quick to impugn the motives or feel as devalued as sometimes I think is the case.
And I actually think this work of becoming a learning engineer, any kind of engineering tends to benefit from experience, right? Where you try it, you measure it, you try it again, you measure it again, and you start to get some real experience at solving these problems in ways that are just measurably better. And so there is real value in that experience. And I think, Rick, you put it pretty well. We're not yet ready to capture that in part, but I think as technologies get used for the right things as opposed to the wrong things, and teachers begin to get engaged with the right things that they can really make a difference on, and they themselves will need coaching and help to become really good at that, that requires experience and time and practice. I mean, teachers are human beings too, it turns out, right? And so the same learning issues we talked about for students apply to teachers as well. And so 10,000 hours, as long as you're focusing on real expertise and have real feedback about what you're doing, it really takes time to get there. And then the trick is, can the task be organized so that everyone ends up benefiting from that development of expertise? A lot of the way it works now is kind of a simple guild work machine. You're not able to benefit from extreme kinds of expertise at scale. It's only those 30 kids who end up benefiting from that. So hopefully as these models get more familiar and new ones come in, it'll become apparent what the value of that real experience is.
And just in case it sounded like I was fudging, so basically the bottom line is I think if our hope is to have 3.5 million teachers who are recruited in their 20s and are going to do it for 30 years and are going to be paid well, that